This is Motovation. I'm Laurie Kingwell.
And I'm Krissy Vann. We're two dreamers on two wheels inspired by our community.
And celebrating the voices we're just lucky enough to discover along the ride. So if not already, like, subscribe, follow along, do what you gotta do to not miss an episode.
Today, we're talking about something that sneaks up on you, like a surprise pothole at full speed: aging parents. One minute, they're offering you advice you didn't ask for, and the next, you're quietly researching power of attorney and wondering when the roles reversed. In our late 30s and 40s, we might still feel like the kid in so many ways, but life has a way of handing us the clipboard. Suddenly, we're managing appointments, juggling medications, and trying to show up emotionally for our parents, even while we're still trying to keep it together ourselves. But beneath the logistics, there's something deeper: the emotional weight of realizing that the final chapter has begun, that the people who raised us are declining in ways we can't ignore, and there's only so much time left. It's a disorienting shift, something we may have watched happen in our parents' generation, but it feels totally different when it's your parent, when it's you in the room now. This episode is about that space, the grief that doesn't always look like grief yet, the tenderness, the confusion, the guilt. And it's also about the conversations we know we need to have, but so often avoid. Talking about the will, end-of-life care, what they want for their remains, and how they'd like to be remembered. They're not easy conversations, but they matter. Because sometimes the most meaningful thing we can offer is just being present, with patience, love, and even some humor, and having the courage to ask the hard questions while we still can. This is the Motovation.
So we talk so often, if not all the time, about these phases and stages of our lives. And a lot of times we're talking so much about moving through the hard times, moving through the challenging times, moving towards something, building goals, all of that. And one of the things, we're 4 years deep, I think now, or something wild like that. And one of the things that we've never even really touched upon, I know that we've mentioned in other episodes, is the fragility of life for obvious reasons, grief, loss, all those different things. But one thing that we all experience for the most part, or the majority of, is the phase in which our parents are in those last chapters of their life. And it just feels like it happens in a blink. And it is such a incredibly beautiful, challenging, scary, at times overwhelming, and in a way feels almost unbelievable when that stage is there, when you're entering in, which a lot of us really are in our, once we're in that late 30s, 40s, 50s, our parents are entering their late 60s, 70s, 80s, and with disease kind of taking over at Mach speed, that sort of thing. But I feel like I myself anyways haven't had a lot of conversations with other people about what that really is like when your parents' age puts them in a position where they're really starting to decline. Ailments are taking over, that type of thing, and how hard it is, and how you're kind of in denial of it. Like, there's ways in which I've been more aware because of, we've talked about in the past, experienced a lot of loss, and then realizing like you only have now. And so I go home every 2 to 3 months to Saskatchewan to make sure I spend time with my mom and my dad, because it's one of those things, I don't know how much time I have truly. My mom's 74 this year, my dad's 75. And even though in many ways they're healthy, they're also, mom's walking with the cane now, which feels unbelievable. Like, you almost thought it was temporary because she had this hip pain, and you're like, no, that's a permanent. But I've never been more reminded or more acutely aware than this last month and a half. I went home to Saskatchewan to go visit my parents. Like I just said, I do. My dad lives alone the majority of the time. Well, not majority, all the time. He's alone the majority of the time, like 98% of the time. And I just so happened to be visiting him, and we're sitting in the yard, and he's in mid-story. And then all of a sudden I can tell that something very serious is happening with him at this moment. His hands started to shake. He started to stare at it. And then he just he couldn't move. He couldn't talk. And I'm realizing, oh my gosh, something really bad's happening and scary. I was fortunate enough that I had enough of an understanding that if this was the moment in time that my dad was passing, which is what I thought was happening in real time, that my dad was having like a stroke or something was happening, that this could be, my last moments and his last moments. And so I just like stepped into making sure that he knew that he was like absolutely loved. And I just like held his hand and I got in front of him and I just said, I love you so much. I've had the best life with you. I made sure first and foremost that like, if this was the last thing he heard, he was going to hear and be looking into my eyes and all those things. And then when I, about a minute, let him know I was going to call the ambulance and so forth. And this episode isn't to really go fully into that experience. It's not really what the episode I think is important to really focus on, but I think it's important to kind of really play out why this feels even more important that we start to have more conversations to support one another. Wherever you are, whoever you are, you're going to enter the stage no matter what with your parents. But it ended up being the next 3 weeks or 2.5 that I was with him in hospital in neurological care. He's a heavy drinker and heavy smoker for, 30 plus, 40 plus years. So it was the damage of that. He'd never had anything like this before. But the first 4 days were terrifying. He slipped in and out of consciousness. He was having seizures. He would go into catatonic states. And I had to really face this reality that like I could be saying goodbye to my dad at any moment. And it was those moments that you recognize and you always know in the back of your mind that those days will be here one day. We've even talked about, like, I used to be so scared for my dad in my 20s because he was such a heavy drinker and smoker that I was convinced he was going to die and that it would be 10 years later. I was like, I don't think I'm going to worry about this guy. Like, he's doing well. Until he wasn't. And it happened in such a blink of an eye. And I would lay there in the hospital bed with him and I would have those moments where I was like, oh my God, we're here. We're here. We're in that day that I always felt so much fear around. We're in that day where I don't know if he'll ever be back to like baseline. Like I was just like, I don't know if I'll ever be on the phone with my dad again. I don't know if I'll ever have like him back, and having to like accept that. And then all the aftermath of like, well, what do we do? Where does he go after this? Where would he want to go after this? Where is he going to be okay? Where is he going to be taken care of? Do I take care of him? Do we take it? My brother and I take it, like all the things that come with it. And it feels like you kind of get catapulted into this role that you're just almost like you're just fully figuring out how to adult. And then now you're like, well, how do I do my life, but then also make sure I'm supporting this person that doesn't even live near me, that I want to make sure is so taken care of. And then there's all the pre-conversations, and we want to talk about that too today. And my dad, a month or a year and a half ago, talking about like, hey, Dad, like we got to have these conversations about, what does it look like for you? And he was so apprehensive of even having any end of life because he was like, it gives me anxiety. I'm like, no, I get that. That's not like, yeah, but we can do it in a way that feels safe. And so we even had all those conversations. So it wasn't even like we were in denial of. We were having all the conversations. My mom and I are having all the conversations. But it's such an overwhelming and scary time the different phases. But again, I want to talk today, and I think we really want to talk also about how beautiful those moments are too. Because like while we were in the hospital and while we were facing those scariest moments, my God, we had some of the most beautiful moments. We spent more time together than I have since I've been 12 years old when he moved out of our home. We would just sit and just say things with our eyes and nothing at all, because sometimes he didn't have his words. And we would just smile at each other, and I would tell him silly jokes and he would get laughing, even though he could barely say anything back. I just would tell him every time he had his eyes open of like, do you know how much I love you? And then we could talk. He'd always be like, oh, I love you more. Like recording these moments. So I had them forever. And so there was also so many moments where I just thought like, these are so imprinted on my soul. And I wouldn't have got these unless this moment happened either. And even my dad said when we were in emergency and he was in between coming in and out of seizures, we were about 10 hours in. And he said to me, this was the scariest day of my life. And then he's also like, but it's also one of my favorites. I was like, a favorite? And he was like, we got all day together. He's like, we've spent the whole day we've had. And I was like, oh, Dad. But it's true, you know, like you kind of have these pop in and out visits. And even though but when you really slow things down, some of those more emergent times keep you where the whole world stopped outside of me being in the hospital. Nothing else mattered than just being with him. And so also that was so extraordinarily beautiful. And I'll have that forever. When the day comes that he is no longer here, those memories are like imprinted on my soul. But I really don't feel like we as people, as a society and all the things, for something that's so incredibly challenging, confusing, difficult, and potentially so beautiful, we just don't talk about it enough that we feel in any way, shape, or form prepared.
Mm-hmm.
I don't.
I think it really comes down to the fact that the absolute only certainty that we have in this life is that we're going to die. The only certainty is death. And I think that if you really put yourself in that mindset of embracing and embodying that certainty, then it forces you to ask a lot of questions about your life. And so I think it's a byproduct, and this is just me riffing, but I truly think from posing that, it's a byproduct of an entire lifetime of not staring at that, because how much excavation would your life require if you truly lived like you are going to die one day? We don't, right? And so I think that it's just a natural byproduct of the fact that we were raised by people that live our life that way, a little bit of avoidance toward that reality. Yes. And then we repeat the pattern and so on and so forth, unless, and like you highlighted, Laurie, in your life, you learned the lesson through loss. In my life, same thing. My dad passed away when I was 17 years old. He was not a well man for much of his life. And so we had a lot of these deep conversations. That being said, even still, my dad being in the condition that he was, and he had his last rites 21 times. That is a religious sacrament where basically you're absolved of your sins. I guess you go up squeaky clean to Jesus or something.
Yeah, that's how it works.
But they do that at the very end of life. 21 times. My dad didn't have a will. He didn't have a will because he did not want to talk about the reality. We all knew the reality and geared up so many times. The man did not have a will, which if you've ever dealt with after death situations where you're grieving, plus the volume of paperwork and all the rest of it is exponential. It made it incredibly difficult on my mom and those that were left there. And even there were arguments in regards to wishes over how he was remembered. There was think about it, you're grieving, and then we have his parents that were wanting a proper Catholic burial. My dad's wishes were to be cremated into a coffee can, explicitly coffee can. Trying to explain that to religious
I was going to say,
they're like,
rip off the old block, Krissy, you and your coffee. That's what I can see you being like, I just want to be with my coffee.
Just want to be with my coffee and become one. But if there had been a will, it would have mitigated a lot of those stressors. And I think that's what Laurie is emphasizing. First of all, I just want to acknowledge how fresh all of this that you just spoke to is for you. So, I think that's one of the most beautiful things of this platform is we've hopped on here in the thick of it. And it just resonates so much because we are in midlife. And I ironically was at a Brazilian wax yesterday of all places. And we got real deep about life.
Yeah, you did. Both sides of it.
About the fact that she was like, how are things? And I said, honestly, I'm like, pretty good, but riding the wave. And I said, this time of year, I was in such flux. And now a lot of people in my sphere are going through such flux. And I said, it's a byproduct of being in midlife where there are different elements that are going to continue coming at us because we truly are in the thick of it. And this one in particular is one you don't want to ignore because we're trying to manage our lives, as Laurie put it so beautifully. We're just kind of learned how to adult, and finally the pieces are rocking. And then you're like, oh, how do I be both? I don't know how to do that. When did the role reverse? Now I have to parent my parent. So one of the things I wanted to point out, I looked up a statistic. A Merrill Lynch study in 2023 found that 70% of adult children have not discussed long-term care with their parents, even though 80% of parents believe it's important. So you almost have 80% on both sides that agree this conversation needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
There is a deep want, but fear is overriding both sides of the equation because it's not a pleasant reality to have to acknowledge that one day we won't roam this earth.
And we won't be together.
And we won't be together.
Yeah.
And it's hard when you are in the crisis to then be sorting all the things. Because as you spoke, Laurie, obviously your initial moment was, holy fuck, I might lose this person that I love so dearly in this moment. How fucking terrifying. All the things are going through your head at that point. But as the situation evolves, you realize now there are all these different puzzle pieces that need to come into place. And in addition to that, sibling dynamics. If you're somebody with a sibling, you're having to figure out whose responsibility is what. And that's very difficult because as we know, with grief and with crisis, everyone has very different ways of moving through that. Oftentimes our nervous systems are generally haywire. I mean, for yourself, Laurie, I know you have a lot of tools, but regardless, you have so much pumping through your system from survival mode of the initial moment, no one's showing up their best. And that's why I truly feel it's crucial, although uncomfortable, to have the conversations before we get there, because the reality is this is the phase of life. If we are so gifted of things to happen in the natural order of things in this life, that is where we are heading. Our parents are aging, and you don't want to have those moments and be so, it's very difficult if you're very unsure over the person's wishes, because the level of responsibility that you feel to make the right choices on behalf of this person, if they're not able to, is unbelievably overwhelming on top of an unbelievably overwhelming situation.
Makes me think of like anything when we kind of talk about the marathon's coming. That big run is coming where you are going to have the stamina, and you're going to have the right shoes and the right, like essentially be equipped, because it's coming. And if you're not equipped, you're running it anyways, but you're probably going to gas out pretty close after the start line. You're not going to have any, blisters, bleeding, whatever it is. It's probably a really ridiculous analogy. I just think of it in regards of, if you know you're headed in there, what we can do for ourselves is get a little training in there, get a little preemptive of like, what am I going to need? What are things that can be taken care of now, so I'm not taking care of it in a crisis state of mind and body and soul? And because it's just that, when you are fully in that experience, to then be like, oh, how to take care of self. Okay, well, let's practice this skill set of communication between me and for me, it was my brother. Luckily enough, about 2 weeks, because this happened at the beginning of May, 2 weeks into May, it was May 13th. My brother and I were together 2 weeks prior to that. We have a complicated relationship, and have had really challenging time communicating with one another in a way that ever really goes well. But we try really hard, and we keep coming back to it. We're committed against all odds. And both of us have really good intentions. So anyways, beginning of May, we had like a little mini blow up conflict. And we kind of came back to it in a headspace, and we're like, hey, this went sideways. Like, this was my intentions. He was like, this was my intentions. Okay, well, let's do this differently. How can we do this differently? Fast forward, it would have been a week and a half later. I'm in Saskatchewan. This happens with my dad. And I'm so lucky. We are so lucky that we actually had that mini blow up moment where we could come back to the table and be like, let's take that and do it differently. Here's how. Because we were lucky enough to have that moment, because I think if we didn't, we would have handled this so poorly together in our interactions, not with my dad, but in his and I's interactions, because we've been able to communicate, knock on wood, up to date, exceptionally well. And we are coming at things a lot of times with different perspectives. Some of them are similar, but we are hearing each other. We are like being so considerate of one another. And so just even that of like us getting our bearings of like how we can communicate a little bit better has ended up helping us already in real time, when we were in a crisis state, show up not only for my dad, but with one another, because it really is, it's coming. And if you can, and it's not like we were doing that so we could show up for our parents when these kind of moments happen, but it's like anything of, for these stages that are coming up, the more that you learn of like, what do you need in those moments? And how can I better communicate with the people that are in my little, family, community, whatever that looks like? It's going to help you that much more when you're in these situations. Even knowing myself, of knowing when I had to tap out and when I had to, go for a walk, even though I was like, oh, I don't want to leave. And it was like, that you have to go for a walk. You have to get fresh air. You have to step out of this building. You have to do that. I know you don't want to, but that's what you need to do. So I would make myself do that thing so that this experience became sustainable, because I had no idea how long it would look like. But knowing what you need, not when you're trying to figure it out in crisis, but figuring it out in your everyday life, is substantial for these experiences. And even those little incremental steps towards it.
I think the drill down of that is curiosity, and you need to have curious conversations. Number one, if you do have siblings, it's one of the things that it's going to create if you don't in advance is tension, because as you said, we see some things the same, we see others differently. And so, I'm in a similar situation to yourself, where my mom lives in Halifax. And those are conversations that even my sister and I need to build upon, because there's almost this assumption, like if my mom could not live on her own, my sister has her home there. So presumably my mom would go there, but is that all right? What does that look like? How would I support her being my sister through that so that it doesn't all fall on her? Because unequal caregiving is going to build resentment and a lot of tension within our relationship and within their own life sphere.
Yeah.
As well with the individual themselves. And this is the hardest part, sitting with your parent, ideally not in a time of crisis, but when things are calm. If 80% of parents want to have this conversation and 79% of us want to have this conversation and no one's having the conversation, we need to be brave enough to set the setting and choose a calm environment to just be curious. Just be curious about what wishes are. And then on top of that, to have the conversation, which seems so abrasive. I remember my mom is the one that initiated with me. And I remember it distinctly because it was in her condo about 2 visits ago. And she was like, look, much like yourself, Laurie, and for myself when much younger, she's like, I've been through this. And it's so hard when you lose someone and you have to do all the after wishes. And also when they're quite ill, it's so hard in knowing what the right thing is to do. You start questioning everything. And so she showed me where all the paperwork is, where the will is, her banking is. I was uncomfortable the entire time. I kept making the same joke I always do to my mom, being like, oh, you're going to live forever, so this is a pointless conversation. But at the end of the day, I'm glad that my mom actually had the gumption to be like, this is awful, but I don't want you in that time that I know is going to be so painful to have to stumble around blindly when everything else is coming at you to sort. And as I say, no part of that conversation was comfortable for me. It's sad and all the rest of it. But I also remember it creating a really beautiful moment when it was done. You hug that person that much tighter because it is all of a sudden that reality that we do get a little delulu over death. We are a bit delusional in much of our life. We don't wake up every morning thinking, might die today. You could. And like, truly, I feel like some of us, although it sounds morbid, should infuse a little bit more of that into our daily step because we would probably treat the day a lot differently. We would invite more gratitude in our lives. We would invite more presence in our lives. What you said in the very beginning of this, Laurie, is such a good example where you said this went on for 2 weeks and everything else stopped. Nothing else mattered. And the two things that mattered most were you being present and his presence. And that was it. And that was everything. That was absolutely everything. And I think it's just important for us to not lose sight of that in our daily lives and not lose sight of the reality that we're facing. The thing that's so beautiful from having these uncomfortable things over logistics, because who wants to talk about wills or what your wishes are in regards to cremation or not? Like all of those are terrifying topics. But it may also invite more curious conversations and reflection over your experience together.
Gonna say
life.
that. Yes. Because it doesn't have to be so scary. And I think that's because especially westernized cultures, we are that is how we build death as like, keep it at bay. Worst case scenario is you die. Everybody suffers when you die. And so keep it over there until we absolutely no ifs, ands, or buts have to look at it. And then we'll all just panic and being horrific until we can get out of it, which many other cultures look at death as like this beautiful ceremonial, like obviously we have funerals and we have ceremony around to some extent for sure, but it's really looked at as a communal way to like grieve and look at the beauty and reflect upon. And some of the most connected times of family members, like cousins and so forth, is weddings and funerals. When you come together and you actually walk away being like, that was such a beautiful weekend because you prioritized family. You made everything stop and was present with the people that you care about, love. But even the conversation I know with like my dad, because he had a ton of apprehension about it and anxiety about his mortality, which is also so just kind of like your dad, where he was open in so many other ways, but then certain things he was just closed to. And that's my dad too. My dad's very philosophical, spiritual. He very much believes that he is a spirit having a human experience. And, but looking at the death part and like is terrifying to him, understandable. So when I even broached it with him, because I knew these were conversations that had to happen or were important to happen. So when I called Dad and said, because I think it was on the phone first that I wanted to essentially preemptively get his wheels turning, because a lot of times I know for my dad, but this is for a lot of people, is they need time for it to be front loaded, to be introduced to warm up to. Versus like, hey, let's have this conversation. And then it's like, and then they can't even really be open to the conversation because they're just processing that it's happening and fight, flight, or freeze is taken over. And so it's putting the toe into the water. And so I just put it out there of, here's the conversation that I'd like to have. Here's why it's important. Here's the kind of scope in which I think that I'd like to talk about. And his first response was like, whoa, no, I don't think so. I don't want to. And I was like, and I just validated. I went into like, I get that. I totally get that. That doesn't feel da 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 da. And then reiterated again, this is why it's important. And this is why it's important to me, Dad. And then, okay. So I was like, I'm going to be home at this time. It was like 2 months from now. Do you think we could have that conversation then? And he was like, yeah, okay. And what I did too is AI didn't exist at the time, but I just went online and was like, what are some questions that I can ask? This is a conversation, and got a little bit of a template. But I also got a template that asked questions that was about reflecting upon what meant something to him. So it could lead him into then reflecting on how has he lived? Therefore, how does he want to transition? And what does that memory look like? So the questions, and I created a really safe container, because the other thing that I know of through my work is that creating a space in which that feels cozy, comforting, keeps the nervous system and keeps the brain more in the present state of the prefrontal cortex versus going into the fear survival state. So I also made sure that I was like, well, let's go into the, backyard, the cozy spot. Let's get like your coffee. And so I was like, so first I started just with questions of reflection. What are some of the most beautiful places you've traveled in the world? What are the places that, stood out to you? And so now he's in this really reflective state, and my dad's like me. Well, I'm like my dad. We're storytellers. So he's in the zone. And then we got to the really hard questions at the end. The ones but they weren't so hard. And even afterwards I said to Dad, how was that for you? And his response was, that was actually really nice. I'm really glad we did that. And some of the questions that were too hard or he didn't have an answer for, I said, no problem. We can revisit this in a couple of months. And now that you feel good about the questions and the experience, have a little think on it. And so rather than it was something that he had answer, he just had more time to reflect on to answer. And so where you say, even though it's uncomfortable, it can be really beautiful and reflective. You can actually preemptively create that environment for the conversation within that kind of bubble or under that umbrella, rather than even kind of trying to find it within the conversation. You can, create that space. But front loading is a really important one, I think, for people that aren't comfortable talking about death, and you've never really had. And you can even, rather than like, we're going to have this conversation, like, when would you like, is just saying, hey, you could even use this podcast or a podcast as an example. I was listening to something and this is what they were talking about. And they were saying like, man, did you know that 80% of people want to have the conversation, and 80, and they'd be like, oh yeah, I guess. I'd be like, yeah. And then I thought, I would like to I think that's important. And then most likely they'll be like, yeah, it's probably an important conversation to have. And then, well, where do you kind of want to, we should have, like, you can even use those things as a buildup versus coming in cold and being like, you're going to die. We should talk about it.
I love my mom, but there was no lead up to our moment together, which did.
No wonder you were uncomfortable and like, fucking hell.
To her condo, haven't seen her in ages. I'm pretty sure it was the trip that I surprised her. And then it was like one evening, she was just kind of like, it obviously popped in her head. And in fairness to her, she had the conversation with her sister not that long prior. But she was just kind of like, I need to talk to you about something, launched into it. And I was like, oh no. And that's where I'm like, you're going to live forever. I was deflection, where I was like, I'm not doing this. But
you were in fight or freeze. You went to like panic for sure.
But similar to your dad, but as the child on the other side of the interaction, as I say, it created this beautiful moment. And I thanked her. I was like, thank you. Because at the end of the day, it's not like the prettiest subject matter for her to talk about either, but I was so appreciative to have had it. And at the end of the day, if it's coming from a loving place on either side, you cannot lose. I think you need to give yourself grace that we might stumble and bumble and fumble through it because it's unpleasant. But I think the overall sentiment will be that you'll be really happy that you did, because as we spoke to right off the top of the podcast, And really any podcast we talk about, it's that shit that happens on a random day when we least expect it. We spend so much of our life worrying, and it's the things that happen when we don't see it coming down the pipe. And that can include an illness of a loved one or sudden shift. I mean, you spent days not knowing how things were going to look over and over again. Yeah. And it was so ebb and flow throughout that. And you're preparing yourself for anything and everything. And this is just one way, given the reality of the phase of life that we are going into, that you can just help make it a little easier on your peace of mind and your sense of peace and your sense of stability and giving yourself a route. It's still going to be horrific to go through. That's just a life reality. It's still going to be painful to go through. That's just a life reality. But you will be so grateful, much like front loading the conversation with a loved one before you entering it. It's front loading a foundation into your life that we all don't love, that we need, of course, but it is our reality. And I think much in life, spending time in denial of it doesn't make it easier when you go through it. That's for damn sure.
Oh, it doesn't. And it also makes it actually harder, because then you respond out of fear, and you're when you're in the moment, you're still doubling down a lot of times on denial. And so you'll do things that disassociate, or you'll do unhealthy coping mechanisms, or keep yourself busy. That was a thing that I learned through the process of the passing of my auntie. And I was with her through that process and end of life process. And at the very last week of life, when it got the scariest, I didn't have the coping mechanisms that I really had needed. And even though I understood that she was going to pass, I hadn't fully accepted that she was going to pass. And because of that, when it became the scariest, I started doing coping mechanisms, busying myself, slightly disassociating. And that made it so much harder, not only in the moment, that denial, because it doesn't disappear because it's happening. It actually tries to hold on and cling tighter. And after she passed, I wanted to do it over so desperately. And so I really looked at that after her passing, and all the different ways in which I disassociated in other areas of my life, or I, would busy myself or whatever it is to avoid the feeling. And so when this happened, there was those moments that my parts of me wanted to run. And I went, you stay present. And I did. In the scariest of times, I stayed so insanely present. And so why is because I was like, you were going to look at this potential loss of my dad. And my dad's one of my favorite people on earth. He's one of the people that I've always said to myself and even other people of like, that will be one of the greatest losses of my life. And I was staring at it in real time, and I stayed put. But that's because I stopped living in denial of what was in all other areas of my life for the most part. Obviously, there's still residuals, and I'll still always look at it. None of us just live without blind spots. But like, I really looked at those over the last 3 years and have worked on them and faced them. And when I see hard things, I go right at it. You can then process it also in real time. And I also was able to do that thing where the first 3 days when I was like just spinning and spiraling, and it felt like emotional whiplash. Also, the neurologist, we had 4 different ones that were giving us different information. So it also felt like I didn't even know what was happening. But the point being is that because I just stayed in it, I still was able to be like, look, this feels like emotional whiplash. I don't know how this is going to end. This really feels like my dad might be dying right in front of me, or is going to die right in front of me. But then there was this switch that happened, and it was after one of the worst days of all the days. And it was, I think, day 3 or day 4. And it was only progressively getting worse, not better. And very little answers, if any answers at all. And I just had this like wave of acceptance that I was either walking my dad home, that I was going to be as present as, and I was going to be there so present till he took his last breath, and that like, that was going to be okay. Or I was walking him on the other side of whatever this chapter looked like, but that everything was happening as it should be. Everything. And even my dad, he woke up out of one of his catatonic states, and you can kind of like, he's groggy and all the things. And I got it on audio quickly, but he says, I've been thinking, he said, this experience is like Eckhart Tolle says, do you know how you know you're having the experience you're meant to have? Because you're having it right now. And even my dad, in this, like, the scariest moments of his life, he, because of his practice and because of the things he reads and the things he ponders and the things that he discusses, and he might not practice the actual actions in other areas of his life. And you'd look and be like, that's a total contradiction, but okay. It held him to be like, this isn't happening to me. This is happening for me. And even though this is all very scary and he didn't know where it was going to end either, he also, in that moment, he was terrified to talk about a will, but in the moment of his potential passing, because he was looking directly at it and not being in denial, he was actually at some of the most peaceful moments I've ever seen him. And so when you have that practice and when you do it and you look at the realness of how scary life really is, but also like the beauty it can offer, and you have a practice of that, it's part of the Buddhist culture, or the Buddhist religion is like looking at your death every day, die every day, not to be morbid, but because that actually allows you to live every day by looking at your death every day. And after my auntie, that is something that when we're like, we don't do that, I'm like, I actually look at my death quite often, because I find that allows me to be so present in my life, because I'm just like, how fortunate it is that I got to wake up with breath in my lungs. You can still be sad. You can still be disappointed. My heart was still breaking, even though I was still in acceptance of. My heart felt like it was breaking, but there was a peacefulness in the heartbreak. And the other component too was once things started to actually increase in his health, which miraculously they did, the same rate at which he declined, he ended up actually getting better. And I'm so fortunate to say that he, for his home, which we didn't even think was ever going to be possible again, he's actually home as of this past Friday, a month later. But here's the other thing, because I was so present in the now, and because I didn't try and escape through, activities or doing things or, fixing or blah, 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 but I just stayed present, I was able to process what I was experiencing in real time. And so when I was no longer in it, I wasn't carrying residuals. I was fucking exhausted. I needed to rebuild my energy, but I wasn't sitting being like, oh my God, is he okay? Da, da, da. Yes, I'd have moments where I'm like, oof, I wish I was there. Oof, I hope he's doing well. But I didn't carry that level of worry that no longer needed it. Like the animal that you shakes it off is there present in the fear state moment. It was closer to that than the now I'm going to process it and look right at it after it's happened, when I can't actually do anything about it, because at some point you have to process it. So you can be in denial from then on, but then now you're processing it after the fact. And that's more confusing to the system and the brain, because it's like, sorry, what am I worried about? Isn't he home and actually doing quite well? Yeah, but but what? Well, but I didn't process it in real time. So it's just those things where the denial doesn't do you any good, and you have to be aware that it's happening, because it's so sneaky denial, because our brains are so good at creating a storyline that it feels like it's real, and it's not. It's just the storyline that's protecting you from the uncomfortable feelings.
Your presence, though, will be the sign. That's why the stillness is so important, because
such a good point, Krissy.
It could feel if you're doing all those things as if it's real, but if you actually sit with it and pay attention in your body and connect your body and mind, it's there. It's there. And that's where, you gave yourself the biggest gift by being present, because then it becomes impossible to ignore.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you're just in it in real time, feeling the feeling as you're having the experience, and they match. Mm-hmm. They
I'm
match.
starting to get so practiced at this. I mean, this is an offshoot, but even in real time, when we were away just for a girls' getaway, and
Yeah.
I've been sorting through my divorce, and obviously that comes with
Yeah.
a myriad of different emotions and things to look at, and you're interacting with the former partner and all the rest of it. But there was a distinct moment where we were sitting, and I felt the tension rise in my body. I know where it lives. I was like, this is in my gut. This is pulling. And I knew right away. And I actually said, I'm like, I'm going to cry as this comes out. But I knew it was just like, oh, this like emotion wave needs to move through. There you are. I see you. And then it flowed through, and the catharsis on the other side of that exponential. And there is a huge part of my life I denied myself of that.
Yeah.
Stuff, years of stuff. And I can tell you, like, paying attention and building that connection with yourself. And I spent a lot of time in silence last year and offlining to rebuild that relationship, but it pays off exponentially, because I do feel like as a human being on this earth, I just function so much more fully and efficiently, but fully is the more important one of the two of those. Like, life is a ride that will
Fully
end
to
one
what
day. So have the
matters.
conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's living fully to what matters. And I think so, like, to summarize really and truly, and Krissy, add yours into as if I miss anything, or your version of it as well. But like, these are really challenging and difficult and beautiful transitions that we're headed to or already within. And the biggest thing you can really do for yourself and your loved ones is look right at it and ask yourself, what do you want it to look like for you? And not just be along for the ride, but you're going into some stormy waters. What kind of boat do you want? What kind, do you have your sailing skills? Do you what skills would you kind of need? What conversations? Who do you want in the boat? Who's going to be in the boat, whether you like it or not, but really look at it as to our parents, our loved ones, our aunties, our uncles. Like, this is just even, when I'm home in Saskatchewan, going to go visit my dad, I'm staying in with my auntie and uncles so I can spend a little bit more time with them on the farm as well. And it's one of those things of like, you really only have so many visits left. And are you prioritizing them, or are you still doing the thing that you did at 20 years old where you go home once a year because that's just what you do, and you put in the time and then you go out, because that's time you cannot get back. And that all of a sudden nothing snaps you out of like routine or this like veiled version of what that time really means, like death. Nothing snaps you out of going, oh my God, I would have done that so differently. But what you can do is you can do it differently now. You can change the trajectory of it all. And one of the most important things you can do for the both of you, for the now and for the later, is have the conversations and have it in a way and do a little due diligence of like figuring it out of how to do it. So it doesn't necessarily have to just be a tough conversation. It can be a really cool and beautiful and connecting and reflective conversation that actually pulls you closer to each other and to that person, to their own lives. They might even say like, my God, talking about this thing, I haven't done that in 20 years. That would be amazing to do one more time in my life. Who knows? That could be a trip that the two of you make together. And then when they're gone, you take the ashes there and that's where you sprinkle it. It meant something to them, meant something to you. It means something to the both of you. And now that's a place that you get to go to. Who knows? But when we just stay in this place of like, hear no evil, see no evil, I'm just not going to deal with it. Then we're only left with the heart and the heartbreak, and it's that much heavier. And then we rob ourselves of all the other autonomy pieces, the connective pieces, the reflective pieces, and the building upon pieces. And also just like invest in yourself, of reminding yourself of you're not just learning about yourself so that you just live differently. You're also doing it so that when the hardest of times inevitably come, that you are more equipped to not only be present to them, move through them, but then also not carry them on the other side, or at least carry the more beautiful parts of them.
I feel like today's version of our song almost needs to be like a hymn.
Motivation. I'll follow you. I can't go high.
Beautiful.
I was really in and out on that one.
Great harmony.
Yeah, great harmony.
Okay. Mine is going to be a little bit more tactical, and I imagine yours going to be a little more soulful, but I could be wrong. But regardless, mine is to do with wills, because as I mentioned there, that's probably one of the biggest discomforts for a lot of people, because at the end of the day, with whole family dynamics, it can bring up tensions. It can bring up qualities you wouldn't expect out of relatives, greed, uncertainty, surprises. So the best thing that you can do is have the conversation. And I want to mention, I looked up some stats here. In the US, only 32% of Americans have a last will and testament as of 2024, and just 48% of Canadians overall. So this really just speaks to what we talked about in the podcast, the fear and avoidance. So my motivation maintenance, and this is not something I've done, but I've thought about, start with yourself. At the end of the day, we are in midlife, and you cannot be disillusioned that you will walk through scot-free from any health woes. You more than likely have some semblance of assets at this point. Anything can happen. And I feel as though if you dip a toe into the process for yourself first, it's a lot easier of an entry point to have a conversation with a parent, or it could even be a matter of inviting them of, hey, I've been thinking of this for myself. I saw this stat. That's bananas. I know so-and-so went through this and it caused all sorts of havoc. Do you want to work on this together?
Yes.
And it kind of takes a little bit of the air out of the weight of what it happens in our head when we hear last will and testament. It sounds fucking terrible, but it's going to make life so much easier, because I can dare say anyone that's listening that's gone through the death of a loved one, I hate to say it, but it really can bring out the worst in people. And as I mentioned before, giving grace, because so many people are operating out of fear state and just clamoring on to anything. You're kind of getting everybody at their worst because you're going through something so stressful. So my thing is dip a toe, get that process started, and maybe it's something that you can teamwork with a parent.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. Mine is more skillful.
Yay, I nailed it. I was like, that's why I wanted to go first too, because I didn't want to leave you like, here's the homework.
Here's a logistics. No, that's a good one, though. That's super important. I think so often we don't actually look at one another, not really look at one another. And one of the things that I really suggest doing is the next time you're with your parents is kind of two things. One is like really look in their eyes when you talk to them. Take in their eyes, the color of their eyes, the shape of their eyes, the like wrinkles in their face. I recognized I don't really look at my parents, and they've aged. And that's part of the reason I'm in denial, is that I don't look at my parents, and I don't until something happens where I'm like, see a picture and I'm like, oh. And so taking in every piece of them, not just to like put in your head of what age they are, but because you only have so many more times you get to look at that face before it is just a picture. And so just that of like, or when my dad, like, or my mom touches or puts her hands, and I make sure I kind of feel what that hug feels like, what that hand feels like, so that I can access that when I can't access them anymore. And the other one is take recordings of them, voices, because pictures are wonderful, but there is nothing like their voices, hearing their voices. When you were a little one, their voices are everything. Their voices are the thing that tells you that you're safe. Their voices are the things that tell you that, like when you're in a store and you get kind of lost, but then you hear your mom's voice and you're like, oh, there she is, and thank God, or whatever it is. Like we don't realize the power of the tone of their voice. And I recognize that a lot of times our parents' voices have been annoying to us for in some ways when we were younger and so forth, but that voice is home to us. And so record their voices. I wonder if it'll come through. I think it will, but this is like a prime example of, or not a prime example, but this is an example of me in the hospital with my dad when I didn't know if we were going to be able to. And these are the types of recordings that I tried to get with us.
Hey, I love you.
There was all these little moments that I would make sure that I just like got the camera ready, because I was like, I don't know. These might be my last, and this might be my little treasures. And so another thing too, just to add to that, is like one of the things that I did about 2 years ago, maybe, is I set my phone up to tape it, but I had like 5 reflective questions to ask my dad. Like, what are your favorite moments of you and me in childhood? Or what are you most proud of me about? And then I recorded them. And so that I could watch it whenever I needed to, when he was no longer here. And so there's all these pieces that you kind of don't think of, because you kind of think they'll always be here, or things that you always wonder what their answers maybe would have been. Ask them. And you don't have to record it. But like for me, I'm nostalgic with, but really, really don't take for granted those moments, and really be so very present with your senses. What you hear, what you smell, what you taste, what you feel, what you like, take it in and like hold it and create a core memory in those moments with it. That's my motivation.
Well, I looked for quotes, and then I was like, there's no other way to end this than the plaque that I have had. It hung in my dad's office. It's one of the things I've carried with me, that same little piece of wood. And much like Laurie said, when you wake up with the Buddhist philosophy of that acknowledgement of death every day, it's this for me, and it's ingrained, and it's how I live my life. The clock of life is wound but once, and no man has the power, or woman, to tell just when that hand will stop at late or early hour. This is the only time you own. Live, love, toil with a will. Place no faith into tomorrow, for the clock may then be still.
I love that one. This is Tia Walker. To care for those who once cared for us is one of the highest honors. And that, my friends, is your motivation.
You've just listened to the Motovation Podcast with your host, Krissy Vann, and me, Laurie Joy Kingwell.
Thanks for joining us along the ride. We've got new episodes dropping every Monday, and we're all about community. So follow us on Instagram at Motovation Podcast, and visit our website at themotovation.com.
And in the meantime, tanks full and full throttle.